giving the keynote. I just heard recording in process. Anyway, Janie Hip is downstairs speaking at the American Agriculture Lawyers Association, giving the keynote address. So, God darn it, women in agriculture. It's absolutely great. Let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm Sarah Vogel. I live in North Dakota. I've been a lawyer for a long time. I was elected the Agriculture Commission of North Dakota back in '88, the first woman in U.S. history to have done so. And I wrote a book about a case that I did in the 1980s, and it's called Coleman versus Block. It just came out, I think, 2 days ago. So it's like nationwide in bookstores. Here's a picture of it. The picture on the cover, if you can see, is the big wheat field with a falling down barn, couple three tiny little people. And that's me and Randy and Lois Oster, who are some of my clients. And Life magazine came out and did a story about the work I was doing in the farm crisis. And so that brought more attention. So the book, I want to first start and say that when I first started working on the issues having to do that I deal with in the Farmer's Lawyer, it was 1978, and I was at the Federal Trade Commission, and I was in charge of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act enforcement program. And we got tons and tons of discrimination complaints about sex discrimination, race discrimination, other kinds of age discrimination. And the worst of all of them was USDA, the Farmers Home Administration, which is now called FSA. But back then, they had an application form that just burned me up. And at the bottom of the application form, it said farmer and a line. And then on the next line, it said wife and a line. But you know what? They wanted women on the mortgage. They wanted women but they were not treating women as equal. So the idea that there's a group such as women like the WFAN is a dream come true. But let me get on. So I have to sort of share my delight that on the back of my book, I have blurbs, and the top one is Willie Nelson. And he says, Sarah Vogel and I share an ornery persistence in the face of bullies. This is a real life story of fighting for farmers as they were pushed off the land by a plan ordered and carried out by top officials of our government. Sarah's story, told in her unique voice, inspires me, and I'm sure it will inspire you to fight for family farmers. So this is really why, Willie put his finger on it. This is really why I wrote the book, is because there are signs that have been visible for quite some time that the U.S. is on the cusp, if it is not already, in many sectors of ag, in another farm crisis. And my hope and dream is that the lessons of the 80s might help to inform people today. And for me, the lessons of the 30s informed me of what the kinds of things that could be done in a farm crisis. So, and this is like a memoir. There's a new term, I just learned it a few days ago, called Memoir Plus. Like Just Mercy is about a lawyer's particular case representing somebody on death row. And it is also about the problems of death sentences and incarceration in the US. And my book is about a particular case, but it's also about the role that we have in supporting the family farm system of agriculture and many of the issues that have led to it and why it's so important for us to save the system of family farm agriculture. And I do have hope especially with people like Janie Hip and Zach Ducheneau and many others, and organizations like this, and all of the good public policy work that's being done. So I think the timing is good on the release of this book, and I worked on it for, depending on how I count, 10 years or 3 years or 20 years. So I think the next slide then. I have a helper. I'm not, oh, this is the picture that is now on the cover. And this was in Life magazine, November of 1982. And I must say that after this magazine article came out, I got calls from all over the country. But it's a pretty famous photograph, and it's evocative of the perils that were there. It's also evocative of prior farm crises. So this is what I was doing, and they called me the farmer's lawyer because my specialty, basically my only clients were farmers who were broke and who had no money. And I was still incensed over the farmer and the wife application form, and knew a little bit about Farmers Home. And I'd grown up in the North Dakota Nonpartisan League Party, which I want to tell you guys about a little bit because it helped me develop my strategy and so forth. So people may not know about it, but there was once a political party that had total control of North Dakota, state, federal, local, and it was called the Nonpartisan League. And they had a magazine, and they believed that there should be state-owned industries like milling and banking that would help farmers, with credit and with milling, so that they could escape the corporate control. There was a lot of tax election reforms. They put in many debtor rights, workers' rights. The theme was economic democracy. And in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression, the governor of North Dakota, my grandfather was his equivalent to campaign manager, announced a foreclosure moratorium where he basically halted all farm foreclosures until the time that relief came through better prices or so forth. It was North Dakota Nonpartisan Leaguers that got passed the Fraser-Lemke Farm Bankruptcy Act, which is the predecessor to Chapter 12 today. And this cartoon shows the sort of the tall, handsome guy with the beard who looks a lot like Uncle Sam. His name was Hiram Rube, meaning it was sort of a pushback on how farmers were treated like rubes. So it's like, hi, I am a rube, and he was Hiram Rube. And the guy by his side represented the workers. So it was an alliance of farmers and labor. And underneath that short, fat guy with the top hat, his name was Big Biz. So there's a lot of similarities between then and now. So my fantasy is that there'd be another movement for economic democracy, like the League had. And it could happen. Next slide then. This is in the 1930s. I forget the state this was taken in, but it was extremely grim throughout the country. There was violence. There was lots and lots of trouble and lots of suffering. And then, of course, so many people went on the road, as evidenced by novels, which was not such a novel, it was more of a documentary, like Grapes of Wrath. And then the next slide. And in the 80s, very similar problems were going on. It was a total crisis. My book has a lot of the statistics, but the delinquency rate with the USDA loans was in excess of 50% on many farms. And Ronald Reagan was, through David Stockman, the budget director, their idea was that there should be less delinquencies. And how do you get rid of delinquencies? Well, you basically pushed farmers off the land. Then when the land was sold, then the delinquency was fixed. Well, that was a harsh and I believed illegal and unconstitutional way to do that. The next slide. So the core of the lawsuit was 7 U.S. Code 81A. I mean, I have to do a little bit of law. I can't help myself. The book, by the way, I tried to make it into a story. In fact, John Grisham in his blurb says, this is my kind of story. So don't be afraid of buying and reading the book, because even John Grisham says it reads like a John Grisham novel. But this was one of the laws that was so important, and it was passed by Congress in 1978. And it said they basically, the USDA may permit the deferral of principal and interest upon a showing by the borrower that they were temporarily unable to make payments when due without unduly impairing the standard of living, and it was due to circumstances beyond the borrower's control. Well, certainly, you know, drought, low prices, trade wars, those kinds of things, incredible inflation. There are many circumstances, but USDA absolutely refused to implement this law. They focused on the word may permit. So deciding whether a particular farmer was qualified to get a deferral, they thought that the may meant the secretary may implement the law or may not. So they didn't implement the law. And a lawsuit was filed in Georgia that had a really great success. And the court ordered the USDA to implement the law and to issue regulations. And had USDA done that, it would have been a wonderful result. But USDA said, well, that was out of Georgia. It'll help people in Georgia, but we're going to appeal it. Many other cases challenging the deferral law, challenging USDA's refusal to implement the deferral law were brought throughout the country. And I decided that I would do that in North Dakota too. But I also knew that if I did not use the appeals process of USDA, I would get kicked out of court because of the doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies. So I went through, so I had farmers, in part due to the farmer network, which is pretty profound, as I think everybody on this room, on this call knows. There were calls coming in all over. And then, so I was traveling around and I was doing these appeals. I'd worked for the federal government when I was out on the East Coast for several years at the Federal Trade Commission and also at the Treasury Department. So I knew that we had to exhaust administrative remedies. And when I was doing that by using the appeal system that USDA then had, I found out that the person who was saying foreclose on that farmer would often be the hearing officer. Or he worked right, and they were all he's, by the way, he worked right under the person who had said, shut that farmer down. So it was kangaroo court is too light a word for the horrible process that farmers had to go through. And this was one of the this photo was taken probably when I was thinking about that appeal process. And the pictures are when I'm preparing with one of the farm advocates of the time, Tom Nichols, who, by the way, is going to be on our Zoom call later this week when we introduce the plaintiffs in the case. I'm jumping ahead, but the process, it was illegal and unconstitutional. So what I did is, over the course of a year, is prepare a case that would challenge both the appeal system and the refusal to provide deferrals, and also to challenge the starve out. The starve out happened because when they decided to accelerate a loan, collect on the loan, they froze all releases of income to the farmer. They emptied the farmer's bank account. They did all of this without notice, and the farmer was left without capacity to buy feed, to buy fuel, to pay for health insurance. It was unbelievably cruel and heartless, and it happened to thousands of farmers. But I was in North Dakota, so, and this is the crux of the story of the book, is it's about the lawsuit that I brought in North Dakota. And so that's the bulk of this book, but there was a lot of drama involved, in part because I'd never been to court before. I'd never filed a case. I guess I had shown up in court, but it was basically just to make an argument. It was not a trial. So it was my first case, and I challenged the starve out, the unconstitutional appeals process. And long story short, which is all in the book, eventually, after a long delay, which was very hard for the farmers to wait for me to do this, we filed a lawsuit, and we got a preliminary injunction that protected the farmers of North Dakota from the starve out and made USDA give them the right to apply for deferrals. And then I think the next slide. So out of all of the farmers I was working with, I wanted to find lead plaintiffs that illustrated the stories that I knew so many farmers had. And so I put them in alphabetical order. This is a picture of Dwight Coleman. He had been in business only 2 years. He had had a blizzard. He'd had a fire. He'd had a low prices, and he'd been in business for 2 years. And they sent him a notice that, believe it or not, said, your loans are fully due and payable. We're going to foreclose on you, and your loans are fully due and payable on Christmas Eve. So he hadn't even had a chance. He was just a beginning farmer. And so alphabetically, Dwight Coleman was the first. Lester and Sharon Crowshart were next. They were Native American farmers and ranchers from Fort Berthold, North Dakota, where their tribes had been farming for thousands of years, kept Lewis and Clark alive when they went on their journey west. And they had been treated worse than anyone I ever saw. Not only had all the things happen about freezing of the income, starving out, there were many people on that reservation that had loans with Farmers Home. And so Lester, when his income was frozen to feed his family, he would work for other farmers, and USDA would seize his paycheck because the paychecks were also connected to Farmers Home. So, I mean, it was unbelievable. Russell and Anna Mae Falmer were prominent Republican farmers in their 50s, loads of equity, and they were falsely accused of conversion because a county supervisor who had been there for 3 days saw that Russell had sold some cattle. He'd sold beef cattle, and then that new county supervisor on the job for 3 days said, Farmers Home has a livestock security interest, and that was conversion, which is a federal felony. So they froze the farmers' income, threatened to foreclose on them, lied a bunch more, and they did not have a security interest because their security documents only said dairy cows. But even though this mistake was pointed out, Farmers Home did not back off. George and June Hatfield, I don't have time to go through all the stories, but they were mistreated too in slightly different ways. And then Don and Diane McCabe, basically also mistreated. Now, some of those folks have passed away, the Hatfields, Russell Falmer, Sharon Crowshart, but the others are still alive. And by the way, none of them regret having been lead plaintiffs on this case, which is very, very good. Makes me happy. This is our judge, Judge Bruce Van Sickle. He'd grown up in the 30s on a farm. He was a prominent Republican, had been in the North Dakota legislature, worked for banks, but he had a sense of justice. So when we went to Judge Van Sickle, he heard us and he gave us a preliminary injunction that protected the North Dakota class 8,400 farmers. And then over the summer of 1983, we saw that farmers all over the country were either failing in the deferral cases and nobody else had this protection against the starve out. So I got a call one night and I was very ambivalent about changing our case into a national class action. I did have support from the ACLU by that point and a class action expert, Alan Tanner was a class action expert, Bert Newborn was the ACLU. All my own time. Oh dear. Okay. Anyway, what happened is that Judge Van Sickle ultimately gave us a national class action. He stopped, there were 16,000 foreclosure cases in court. They were all stopped and there were like tens of thousands more in the process of foreclosure. And Judge Van Sickle's order stopped them all. If you watch the movie Country, which is almost a documentary with Jessica Lange and Sam Shepard, won many awards. That tells the story of a typical farmer, and it ends with the national class action injunction. So from that, USDA did not give up. They tried to change the regulations. The Jim Massey and other lawyers, the original lawyers, kept fighting on. I left to become an assistant attorney general because I thought it was done. Anyway, it ended up as another litigation, and it also stopped foreclosures for years. And when Farm Aid held their first concert, they gave a big grant to the Farmers Legal Action Group, which started that. The Ag Credit Act was the in many ways the solution because it provided restructuring of debt, which is something that none of the litigation had ever tried to obtain to Congress provided it. And inside, the thing I'm most proud of is that inside the 1987 Ag Credit Act are a series of changes that Congress called the Coleman reforms that set up neutral hearing officers, proper appeal process, and I think that's the last legacy. And basically, we are out of time. And I also have to share that as we are speaking right now, Janie Hipp is the general counsel of USDA, and she's downstairs speaking to the American Agriculture Law Association. So women have come a long ways as I've been watching this with USDA. That now it's we got a general counsel who's a woman and a Native American. It's pretty exciting. So this is the rest of my career. I became Commissioner of Agriculture. I then went into private practice. For 20 years. I litigated again against USDA for discrimination, which is a Native American case, which ended up in the creation of the Native American Agriculture Fund. And so this is a picture of, we had Farm Aid Day at the State Fair when I was Ag Commissioner, and Willie Nelson was there. And so he was on the road, and so I've sort of been on the road too since that case. And I'm really delighted that there's an organization like WFAN, and I think advocacy can pay off even if it seems impossible. So thank you. We need help. Farmers need help. That's what we have to do. And this quotation by Williams Jennings Bryan, I think, says it all. Destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. So that's it. And I don't know if anybody, if we're over, if there's time for questions, could I get a little guidance?
Sarah, it's a hard stop at 9 o'clock. So I think we're going to wrap it up. So thank you so much for all of this. I believe it was recorded. So I think WFAN might be sharing later. So, and how can they connect with you, Sarah?
Yeah. Oh, I've got a website. It's called SarahMVogel.com. And I've got a ton of stuff on the book. I've got a ton of essays. I've got a ton of ideas on things that need to be done and links to organizations that are carrying on this work. So if you would go to SarahMVogel.com, we could all be connected through that. And there's Facebook and so forth and so on too.
Excellent. And I shared that link in the chat. So thank you so much, Sarah. And in the chat, there's lots of thank yous for all your work and support. So
I can't wait to read them. I love all of you. Thank you so much. Carry on.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Right. So Sarah,